To create our Angular application, we'll start by creating our first client-side JavaScript file. This will be the main entry point to our Angular application, and that's going to go inside of an app directory. And the file name is going to be app.js. The first thing this file needs to do is define our Angular module. And this module is going to depend on the ng-resource and ng-route modules. We'll also define our client-side routes inside of this file by calling the config function. We'll bring in our route provider, and we'll also bring in the location provider, which we'll use to turn on HTML5 mode for routing. We'll use our route provider to define our routes. And right now we'll start out with just one route that goes to the root of our application. Our template URL will be partials main. And right now we don't have a server-side route for that, but we'll create one in just a second. We'll also define the controller, which we'll call main controller. And the last thing we'll do inside of this file is just create a very quick main controller that we'll only use to verify that our application works. We'll move this controller to its own file later on. We'll create a simple variable called myvar that will stick on the scope that we can bind to prove that our Angular application is working. We need to include this file in our scripts file. We also need to create the partial file that our controller is going to request. Now we have a choice to make here. Typically we author our Angular partials using just plain old HTML. That works great, but the Jade syntax is so nice, it would be fantastic if we could author our partials using Jade. So we can stick with what's simple and use HTML, or be a little more adventurous and use Jade. There are pros and cons to each method. If we just stick with HTML, then the routing is extremely simple. Our static route will serve up the files. But if we just use HTML, then we'll have all those extra angle brackets to deal with. If we want to use Jade to process them, then our routing becomes a bit more complex. We can't just serve up the Jade files, they have to be processed by the Jade templating engine. So we'll have to use a different route that's special for them. We'll want to use some kind of a unique path identifier for partials. Also, due to this increased complexity, there's a greater chance that we'll get something wrong along the way, and the results can actually be as bad as crashing our page. We'll actually show an example of that later on. But on the good side, the syntactic sugar of Jade makes authoring your partials so much nicer. So when deciding on whether or not to use Jade for your Angular partials, be sure to carefully consider the pros and cons of each option, and choose what works best for you. For this course, we are going to go ahead and use Jade for our partials. We'll do that by going within our views directory and creating a partials directory. And this is where we'll put all of our Angular partial files. And that partial was named main. So we'll create a main.jade file. I'll put a couple of things inside this file. An h1 tag that says that this is a partial. And an h2 tag that Angular will bind to the contents of that myvar variable. Now I also need to go into the index file. And I'm going to remove this h1. And I'm going to create a div that has the ngView attribute on it. Next I need to go into my layout file and add the ng-app directive to the body tag. And the last thing I need to do is define a server-side route for the partials files. So here inside my server file, I'm going to go right before my catch-all route and define another route. This will be anything that starts with the word partials. And then I'll define a placeholder for the part after partials. And inside of here, I'll render out that partial by appending to the string partials that partial path placeholder. This is very similar to the route that we already defined, where here we tell it to render out our index view, but in this case we're just doing a little bit of replacement. So when somebody requests /partial/main, Express is going to render the main.jade file inside the partials directory inside the views directory. And now we can check that our server is running correctly, which it is. So let's go to the browser and see how it looks. Alright, and now we've got a bare bones Angular application running.